Thank you for coming along to this symposium on women, ageing and care, emerging perspectives. I'm Shirley Jordan from Newcastle University. I'm also currently co-director of the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing, along with my colleague Guda Sussex over there. And that's the centre that has enabled the running of this event. And a couple of thanks just before I continue to the administrators who've been fantastic. Without them, this wouldn't have happened. So Kathy Collins and Jane Lewin, and also a thanks to Gudala as well. So, women, ageing and care, emerging perspectives. If we took just any two of those terms, we'd already have some very complicated discussions lined up. Ageing and care, women and ageing, women and care. So I'm thinking we're going to have some extremely rich and complex discussions ranging freely over all three terms. I don't yet know exactly what's going to be in the papers, or indeed what's going to emerge from the round table. So one of the delightful dimensions of this event is that it's going to be very free-flowing and trying to look at what we think are some of the big emerging questions, really. I mean, there's already a fantastic amount of literature that's come out in recent years about women's experiences of ageing, about care, going back to the seminal texts of the 1980s of feminist care theory and beyond. There's been quite a rush of texts looking at the personal experiences of care in recent years. Texts that I think are incredibly supportive and helpful, actually, for anybody who's involved in the intricacies of care relationships. Also, as I said, a lot of text on what it means to grow old, currently, to grow old in a fairly ageist society, and to start thinking about needing care. Hello, Lynne. I'm really delighted to see you. Please sit down.
I've got lost in the standard house.
It's very easily done. And all the doors look the same. And some of these include, really bold and rousing calls for systemic approaches to rethinking care, such as this magnificent Care Manifesto, which was published in 2020. Thank you. So, we've got more discussion, more debate, more literature coming out on these important areas, and this event is rooted in the kinds of questions being asked in these publications. It gives us the opportunity to revisit some of them together, so to ask, what do we understand by care? Who's responsible for it and in what contexts? How are women implicated in relationships of care, and what are the politics and practicalities of this? What thinking needs to be pursued in the name of care, locally, nationally, and internationally? And beyond this thinking, what actions, what activism maybe? In short, what are the most pressing agendas now in terms of care, of ageing, and of women's intricate relationships to all of these? Just briefly, our event is also rooted in a small project that originated here in the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing in 2022. This was an online symposium about how women are writing about care and about the value of narrative, and in allowing this often tricky nature of interpersonal relationships of care to surface, so that we can grasp what's really going on in care relationships more completely. This gave rise to a recently published book I'm going to mention very quickly, which appears on the handouts that you have got, Women's Narratives of Ageing and Care, co-edited with my colleague who is also co-organiser of this event today, Emily Jeremiah from Royal Holloway University of London. We'll be toasting this book at the reception at the end of the proceedings, and also saying a couple of words about the larger book series, Cultures of Ageing and Care, with De Gruyter, of which that is the first volume, and there are another 4 volumes now in the pipeline, so we're very pleased about that. I should also say that if you Google me, so if you go to my email address and send me a request for an access token to this book, you'll be able to access it for free between now and the end of June, and have a little browse and read, download whatever you would like, and you'll find that email address as well on the sheet that is sitting on your seat. Housekeeping notes. I'm told that if there's a fire alarm, it's a real one. So if you hear one, proceed to leave the building in an orderly fashion. Also, there's a podcast being made of the event. Nobody in the audience will be captured on this visually, but do be aware when it comes to the round table, if you want to ask a question or the Q&A sessions, then your question may well be picked up, and indeed it would be great if it were. So if I could encourage you to speak loudly when you're asking a question, that would be fantastic. I think that's it. We can move on now to our first paper. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Lynne Segal, who is Professor Emerita of Gender and Psychosocial Studies. She retired from Birkbeck in 2020, I think, but has apparently never been more active. So she publishes very widely, most recently on feminism, ageing and care, and also lectures regularly in the UK, Europe and elsewhere. Recent books include, and I'm sure many of you will have read and enjoyed this terrific volume, Out of Time, The Pleasures and Perils of Aging, from 2013, Radical Happiness, Moments of Collective Joy, we could all do with some of those, in 2017, the Care Manifesto, which I've already mentioned, co-authored with the Care Collective, that came out in 2020, and more recently another fantastic wide-ranging book on care called Lean on Me, The Politics of Radical Care, and that came out in 2023. And Lynne is currently addressing issues of radical friendships, love and solidarity, along with the ways of working with many other Jewish anti-Zionists for peace in Israel and Palestine. I will call up your PowerPoint presentation here, Lynne. This one, yeah?
That's it.
Slideshow. Okay, very good.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, yeah, I'm glad I arrived.
So waiting.
There you are. Well, it's wonderful to be here and celebrating the book, which I thought would be on the page, so I hold it up, but you see it there. Women's Narratives of Aging and Care. So, I wanted to begin in these rather gloomy times where little good news arrives from anywhere, least of all the Middle East, with sharing some thoughts that are more joyful. And so I begin with a quote from Joan Nestle, who is here. Oh, how do I do this? I do it like that. How do I get that down? Oh, it's this one. Is that one? Yeah. Right.
So that should be it. Yeah.
Yes, that's not so clear. So, Joan Nestle, who some of you might know, was a feminist, a Jewish feminist, lesbian, sex radical and ageist resistor, born in the USA, although now living in my home country, Melbourne. And she was widely celebrated, particularly in the heyday of women's liberation, as a lesbian feminist, and wrote a lot then, although in my view not quite celebrated enough. And in her book, A Fragile Union, which you see here, which is now written 25 years ago, and she's still alive, when she was first ill with cancer. She's had a few other cancers since then, but still determinedly presenting a desiring self to the world, even as in this book, A Fragile Union, she records her own bodily weaknesses and its dependency on others. Thus, in her late 50s, and starting a new relationship which took her to Australia, Joan Nestle wrote, "Grey hands and textured hands are now erotic emblems I seek out now. I find old age to be a time of great passion in my life, a time of deep commitments to the forging of fragile solidarities. So I thought they were rather lovely words for us today on women's thoughts on ageing. And of course, they gave me my title. But there've been so many other ageist resistors who are almost always women. We've only got one man here today. I'm glad to see there is one. Two men. Sorry, I didn't notice the other one. He was hidden there. But on the whole, they have been women, especially, and you've been writing a lot on old age and trying to enjoy old age, all these subversive women. Now, most of you will also know of the late wonderful Ursula Le Guin and her many books, speaking on women and ageing at Bryn Mawr, welcoming new young students in 1986. She said, "In this barbaric society, when women speak truly, they speak subversively. They can't help it. If you're underneath, if you're kept down, you break out, you subvert. We are volcanoes. When we women offer our experiences as our truth, as human truth, all the images change. There are new mountains. That's what I want to hear erupting." So that is her. And yet these women trying to talk confidently in old age with such optimism, defiance and resistance always have to battle the gloom and negativity that remains the public face of ageing in the mainstream. Now, as was mentioned, it's now over a decade since I published my book on the topic, Out of Time, The Pleasures of and Perils of Aging, which is temporarily out of print because it's the people who printed it went bust, but Verso assumes me that they are going to bring out a new edition. So I will be writing, I hope, a new introduction, because that one was written when I was 70, I'm now over 80. So, you know, those 10 years matter. However, I'm still here, even if I get lost getting here. How can it be, we must still ask ourselves, that today, with a plethora of work on ageing, those public narratives of ageing, for the most part, can continue to be either disparaging or dismissive of old people. It's surely all the stranger when, short of an early death, as many point out, we will all grow old. Hence, ageism is prejudice against ourselves, our own future selves. However, maximising our potential, by which is meant in our today's neoliberal, market-driven society, is always, sadly, that we must present ourselves and expand our value for the market. That's expand our value for the general prosperity of capitalism. And as we'll see, so too has been the lowering of state spending, whatever its obvious failures, and quite what Labour is going to do to reverse that remains a question we're all waiting to see when their next budget comes out. So what we have seen is the lowering of public spending on welfare, hence always stressing the somewhat delusional notion of individual autonomy and independence. We don't need other people, we don't need help, over any recognition of our human interdependence and shared fragility, actually, throughout our lives. And this is why it's been tragic but true that all the latest reports on ageing still find hostile associations with older people dominating in all areas of society, including the media, advertising, and both central and local government. Indeed, such stigma is present across all age groups, which is interesting, perhaps bizarrely including the elderly. Although strongest of all in middle age, as a recent comprehensive study from Centre for Aging Better, which some of you may know about, confirms. Hence, it seems, the closer we came to that fluctuating definition, the definitively old, which was once 60 and then 70, and now I've read recently it's seen as 80, the greater the aversion expressed towards the elderly. This helps explain why the first thing old people usually will tell you when interviewed is simply, I don't feel old. Whatever their age, they may be 100 today, to say, I don't feel old. Rejecting, of course, that caricatured image of old people, that one you'll all be so familiar with, old people bent over with their walking sticks, of old people, which trail such pejorative connotations that even the charity Age UK never uses these terms. Only the expression older, they say, is unobjectionable. Now that is certainly disconcerting in a charity dedicated to promoting positive images of old age, but they don't dare mention it themselves. Such rapid repulsion towards the term old is also then why Age Concern renamed itself in 1971, discarding its original name, Old People's Welfare Committee, first set up and chaired by the independent feminist MP Eleanor Rathbone in 1940. Hence, attempts to combat ageism and understand its underlying gendered dynamics, which is why we're here, what Caring Fictions aims to do, hoping to topple this long impact of prejudice against old people, as well as the ambivalence or worse toward those who care for them, which we'll be getting onto, most often women, who have been systematically undervalued, as we know, underpaid, marginalised, again, as so many essays in this collection highlight. I think I've gone to the third one yet. So ageism, as I've said, seen as negative attitudes towards and treatment of the elderly, has always been with us, though expressed differently across time and place, and according to a myriad other variables. Yet, however expressed, another thing is that cultures of ageing have always been gendered, as women in particular, and early on, face what can feel like the scandal of our ageing flesh. So, though if you get a tan, it makes you look younger. That's the trouble when you look away, you lose your place. The scandal of our ageing flesh, while all of us trying to hang on to who we think we are in that long process of self-construction, trying to have a definite, clear sense of ourselves, which, given that we're aged by culture, by how people see us old people, gets harder and can get harder to maintain. I see the second man now. Particularly if you're treated with no respect, or people, you're just more or less treated as useless. So I want to go down another one. Yes, where I'm talking about the long history of ageism, saying that historically cruel caricatures of the old have predominated, with ambivalence at best the pervasive sentiment. And again, however much old men have been lampooned for their infirmities and lechery, it's aging women who enduringly arouse the most terrifying degree of horror, actual horror, in their beholder. So throughout world literature and across historical time, right up to the present, because people are always telling me, oh, it's not like this then, it's not like this in my society. Well, actually, if you look more closely, it usually is like that. Throughout time, we can find women depicted as dangerous and destructive creatures when seen as having any power, and as gorgons, witches, or medusas, but that's what having any power, or when seen as feeble, repellent objects of pity and contempt, as dependent old hags. So there we have definitively, with or without her broomstick, the witch, symbolically, is female. There have been male witches, but you think of the witch as female. One who gains power in weird and wicked ways via her magic spells and historically perverse coupling. grappling with the devil. And this is actually there in clerical literature. That terrifying creature, she who must be destroyed, was how the two German clerics, Jacob Springer and Heinrich Kramer, summed things up in their popular treatise on the prosecution of witches in 1487. And as you'll know, probably, witch hunts and the killing of witches went on for several centuries in Europe and also the USA. So these good men of the church wrote of women's intrinsically weaker nature, which made her a conduit for the devil to enter, especially when she was powerless and she had her frustrated sexual passions and secret longings for the power she lacked. Or, you might recall, much esteemed, rightly, a great writer, William Shakespeare, in Macbeth, when his heroes encounter destitute old women living in the forest because they can't afford to live anywhere else. And one wonders to the other, what are these creatures, so withered and so wild in their attire? They look like the inhabitants of the earth. Sorry, they look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it. Returning to the witch, have I done Goya?
No.
You see, I'm very bad at these PowerPoints. Returning to the witch, that old woman who must die in fairy tales or children's stories for there to be any sort of happy ending with Hansel and Gretel, we might consider Goya's obsession with old women on their broomsticks, stealing away beautiful young women, or else eating babies. That's another thing that you often get in extreme prejudices, of course, that the old women want to eat babies. And there's also images of old women in art down the ages. I can see why I'm getting confused, because on this one I've got the next slide as well, because I'm never quite sure where I'm up to. Right. The images of women in art down the ages, so easily mocked as fat, ugly and stupid, most notoriously, as you might recall, in the famous 16th century Flemish artwork of Quentin Matsys, who was one of the best known artists of that moment, with his overtly misogynist, ridiculing images entitled An Old Woman, but better known as the Ugly Duchess. So no wonder women don't like to identify as old when they're the images we have. There's a lot of controversy over that artwork, with some people saying, well, it's actually a man. It's actually a man in drag, but I won't go into all that. However, there are also other reasons that I talk about in my book, Out of Time, which might lead us to say we don't feel old. Not so long, in a large survey in the US, it was found that at 50, almost half of all respondents said they felt at least 10 years younger than their chronological age, while a significant number in their late 60s and early 70s reported feeling at least 20 years younger than their actual age. And I'm sure we would find the same thing today. That was done about 10 years ago. So, what I was going to say is in Out of Time, I suggested that despite the many reasons we have to push away those pernicious images of old age and say that we feel our age to be much younger, like I can still feel myself to be in my 40s or 50s rather than my 80s, there can be sort of psychic reasons for that as well. So it's evident in the timelessness of much of our psychic life, when at certain times, in certain places, we can just sort of think of ourselves as the younger people we once were. With that sense of who we were still there in our minds or in our unconscious, can lead us again to think, not an old woman, I'm certainly not simply an old woman, and I describe that as having a degree of temporal vertigo is inevitable as we age. On the one hand, we do register our bodies and minds in constant transformation, and especially, of course, the impact we have on others, treating us as old. But on the other hand, it can seem as though the self, our inner self, or at least the versions we were able to construct and try and hold on to over time, never actually ages. So we can still at times dream ourselves as the young person climbing that tree or earning that pet or whatever. And I illustrated that. Well, many people have illustrated it. But the idea that in some sense, our psyches don't age. I quoted Virginia Woolf, who loved to ruminate on time, memory, and memoir, as she summed up in her diary, age 49, just the year before she killed herself, actually. I sometimes feel that I have lived 250 years already, and sometimes that I'm still the youngest person on the omnibus. So I can recognize these psychic swerves, and maybe some of you can. Of course, nowadays, we are skeptical of any notion of the true self. Here, I've also quoted Lessing there, her saying, you know, secretly we don't age at all, which is what she wrote at 71, and that's why we put pictures of ourselves on the mantel shelf as young, because that's how we can feel at times. We're still that young person. Well, of course, we do age, but she's saying that we can feel that we're still that same young person that we always were. So I said I recognise these psychic swerves, and even though we are nowadays more sceptical of any notion of the true self, they always misrecognition, as if there were any Lacanians here, they would tell us, because we know that instabilities and tensions are always evident, both in our storytelling and in our memories and fantasies. You know, we can remember things that never happened, for instance, and remember them very firmly. You may have had that experience. And not remember, of course, rather significant things that did happen. Nevertheless, we must always try to hold on to some sense of our identity. And we know that our friendships help us to do that. You know, if we don't have people affirming who we are, if we're if we're just ignored, as many people may be in care homes or as when sick in hospitals, then we're likely just to turn our backs to the wall, and that will be the beginning of the end of us waiting for death. And this is nicely illustrated in a number of the books in a number of the essays in the book we're celebrating here, Narratives of Aging, as evident in, I think I might have to go to another one here. Oh no, it's not up to that yet. Okay, not up to that. Evident in essays here, such as Emily Jeremiah's discussion of Emma Healy's Elizabeth is Missing, in which its protagonist, Maud, with dementia, knows she forgets and knows that she is always being patronised for that, but also has periods of complete lucidity, as when saying, I can hardly remember my old face except in flashes, or again in Joanna Cannon's Three Things About Elsie, the central character Florence is also living with dementia, yet can reflect on that old people's minds, she says, conjure up things out of nowhere and invent all sorts of nonsense, while also being struck by her reflection in the mirror, wondering how long have I looked this old? So, it was Freud, of course, someone I used to teach in psychosocial studies, who spoke of the atemporality of the unconscious. However, unlike in Narratives of Aging, we don't find richer stories of old age in Freud's writing. From middle age, Freud himself was lavishly projecting his own fears and anxieties about aging, illness and mortality onto his contemporaries, suggesting people generally, but of course especially women, become rigid and uneducable from around the age of 50. He was around the age of 50 when he wrote that. Freud is thus part of the problem here. He was in fragile health, and he was frequently desolate about getting older. As he wrote to his woman friend Lou André Salome, who he had once been the doctor for, and she then became an analyst herself. Salome at 70, no, sorry. Freud is saying at 71, with me, crabbed old age has arrived, a state of total disillusionment, whose sterility is comparable to a lunar landscape, an inner ice age. He's still writing away, though, and living quite a reasonable life by this time in Hampstead. But here, happily, we can again register another female ageist resistor, because Salome, a mere 5 years younger than Freud, whom he described as his indomitable friend. Oh dear. I'll continue. I'll put it off. Salome at 66 teased Freud with her contrasting affirmation of aging. So she responds to Freud. Yeah, and you press, do I press? I never know what to do. Which one do you press? You just put it on. Oh, that's what you press. That's fine. Oh dear, sorry about that. You see, that's the sort of thing that happens when you forget about all your equipment. So like it says, I had feared that old age might set in too late, because she actually didn't reach the menopause till she was 60. And that in this way I might be cheated of what old age specifically has to offer. So no lunar landscapes for her. Fortunately, she says, I have been able to capture something of it, and certainly it does bring happiness. Indeed, if I had to choose between the two phases of life, I'm truly not sure on which on which age my choice would fall. So then, we know that, or you may or may not know, that in recent decades, just a few analysts have begun disputing Freud's extreme negativity towards the old, and his suggestion that old people can't be analysed. But still, there seems to be a long way to go in psychoanalytic writing. But let me turn now to care and carers of the elderly, knowing that as we age, often, but not always, we do find ourselves becoming a little more fragile than before. So we're always fragile in life, but we become more fragile before. And we may. And this is another huge source of ongoing gerontophobia. So that was my next one. It connects with demographic changes and the fears, and it's all living longer, living a whole generation longer than we did a century ago, and government fears that they can't afford to care for the growing number of elderly people when lifespans have increased so dramatically. Even though, as we live longer, we also live more healthily, which is one reason why we're living longer. Apart from the fact also we have better drugs for many of the conditions, heart conditions and lung conditions, both of which I have, which I take drugs for, and they seem to keep me reasonably okay, which they weren't around a generation ago. Thus, for some time though, we've heard talk of the tsunami of too many elderly people, that's the tsunami there, claiming pensions, using up the money needed by the young, and so on. Although it's often the old who are actually caring for the young, doing grandparent duty and so on. And we hear this too from government ministers. No, we can't afford it. Even though, of course, the elderly have paid in to their pensions all their lives. Meanwhile, again, this is illustrated in your book here, Our most important workers, care workers, routinely women, often themselves older women, who do the near invisible labour of caring, have always been most undervalued, as I mentioned before, which is why this book, Narratives, Gendered Narratives of Women's Narratives of Ageing, is dedicated to women carers. Now, as the book also suggests, care is an ambivalent and contested concept. Nowadays, though, increasingly commodified. People are paying for their care in old age. Care homes have all been sold off by our local authorities, like our water and all the other essential services. Hence, rendering hands-on care often undertaken in wholly inadequate, under-resourced, pressurised conditions. Meanwhile, care is further devalued in its commercial users, as markets overall usually pretend themselves to be caring, delivering your items with care from Amazon, despite the miserable conditions of the workforce, which in the Care Manifesto we refer to this as care washing. Hence sort of hollowing out the very notion of care. And again, as we can read in the collection we're celebrating here, and as I said at the start, our universal need for care throughout our lives comes up against that neoliberal delusion of the self-sufficient, autonomous individual. Thus, one key issue we are battling in trying to encompass gendered ageing and care is the refusal to accept that fragility and human dependence are simply part of the human condition. We are always interdependent and should be organising our politics around that recognition and what might be our shifting needs of care as we age. Thus, in my last book, as was mentioned, in Lean on Me, The Politics of Radical Care, I began from a rejection of our general cultural disavowals of dependency. I wanted its subtitle to be Disavowals of Dependency, but Verso wouldn't run with that. They thought it was too negative. Which ties in so closely with people's fears of aging. A lot of people fear getting old and being dependent more than they fear death. But that's a terrible thing, isn't it? So becoming that stigmatized thing, dependent, when in reality we're dependent all our lives, and not just as infants. We're dependent on education, on transport, on healthcare. We're always dependent on welfare. But when we're young and going off to work to make profits for others, then the fact that we need all these resources are not sort of seen as something that the state has to provide to meet needs. But it seems to me that once we acknowledge our need for and lifelong ties to others, along with our shared vulnerabilities, fears of loss, enduring actual loss, enduring rejection, and all the other injuries we suffer throughout life, it should become easier to face up to and accept the changing conditions of growing old. However, we face a problem when confronting our shifting needs for care and the importance of caring, when it also involves addressing the role of the state, involves strengthening our communities, involves commitment to diverse forms of welfare to enable the social inclusion of everyone, whatever our situation in life. So this also takes us to the realities of our ever-growing social inequality, which have been covered so well by other writers such as Danny Doyling, telling us that we're now living in times of peak inequality, and the fact that longevity varies so much across social class and ethnicity and other things, with certain people, certain groups of people living at least a decade longer than other groups of people, which is, we'd have to all agree, extremely shocking. So that is why, thinking about, when I had actually begun writing Lean on Me and saying I was working on care, when a number of others said, oh, we're interested in care, let's form a reading group. So we formed a reading group around 2015. And then they said, oh, we want to write about care too. So then my book got shoved aside for a few years, and the Care Collective, 5 of us from different backgrounds, began reading and writing about care and the overwhelming significance of care, as we said, as the basis of all subjectivity, and as well as, of course, assumptions around care underpinning gender roles, while the grotesque lack of care at all levels has become a key crisis of our time. Today, people generally in the workplace are barely given time or space for providing care or for creating new generations, having children. With others, such as Joan Tronto and many other feminists today, we define care as all that enables people to flourish along with the world we inhabit, which is certainly itself not flourishing in many places. Hence, we were interested in the manifesto and also in my book in expanding the notion of care from hands-on care to caring about and within our communities and caring about the world and the future of the world, saying, well, you can't have any care for each other unless there are these broader resources around us. So the Care Manifesto insisted that care needs to be placed at the very heart of politics, which is essential if we're ever to overcome the hundreds of thousands of elderly people who live with little or no care, or the daily scandals of collapsing care homes. I used to be reading about them all the time, and they are still collapsing, although I haven't read about them quite as much. Privatised care homes, of course, because once they can't make a profit, then those big finance companies who are often funding them, expecting, I believe, something like a 12% profit return, close them down when they're not getting that. So, and meanwhile, of course, as we know, carers working in these companies which are providing care for profit for themselves are themselves often living with in-work poverty. So we finished our manifesto just before the COVID pandemic swept around the world, which of course underscored every point we made and why we lost so many people very early on, and in particular, why we lost so many old people who, as you probably know, were sent back to their care homes without testing them for COVID. And so it was completely rampant in care homes, killing both the elderly there and their carers. But writing it at that time made us hope that we were at a crossroads where care just might be put at the centre. It might rise up the political agenda, along with evidence of more people suddenly appreciating our licensed carers, as well as the emergence of new forms of alternative care, of collectively organised care. And so many people I knew then were engaged in, helping out at food banks, helping deliver food, noticing elderly people on their street and so on. So there was briefly a change in people's attitudes, particularly because a lot of people weren't working, so they had more time. Right. But sadly, our hopes weren't realised in any big way, because the hope of putting care at the basis of our politics is a journey we've barely begun. As should we spend more money on defence? Should we remove those essential resources for the disabled, removing PIP and so on? So there's, terrible things in relation to care are still being proposed, whatever the obvious urgency of the need to care better for each other. As well, I've mentioned the criminal incompetence and lack of care that went on in the handing out of certain money to those pretending that they were going to deliver suitable masks and equipment for hospitals, being given to friends of the Tories who were in power then. And so, the calamity of social care continues with, as I said, 1.4 million elderly people still finding that their caring needs are largely unmet. Meanwhile, those caring for older relatives or spouses cannot very easily access resources or any respite care, as Catherine Venema illustrates in her chapter in the book being launched today. Carers themselves face, if in paid work, underpaid, 0 hours, curtailing any continuity of care. One crucial figure in the UK care politics in the academy is Bev Skeggs, who you may have heard of, who wrote movingly of the dual institutional collapse of our NHS and caring systems when each of her parents were dying. First of all, her mother and then her father. They lived up north and she was working at Goldsmiths. In fact, she had to give up her work for a while, and she talked of the extreme lack of care each of them had experienced in the period leading up to their deaths in the north of England. And she described the situation then as a crisis of humanity. Neglect by design, she said, is the name of the game. So that's, I've got a few statistics there, which again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So, can we say anything more positive? I'm sure that should have a heading. So, how might we start turning around this situation, accepting the care and the need for inclusive caring, whether for the elderly or the disabled, or the mentally ill, all those in need of special resources for care, provided for, which you'd think would be the case in any healthy society, one which would aim to care for all its members of any age or condition. Well, we could first of all begin, as I try to do in Lean on Me, with unpacking the impoverished language of care, addressing all that has systematically been devalued as care, as many of us, including all the contributors to women's gendered narratives of care, are saying. So we all agree that care has been undervalued, largely because it's been seen as women's work, even though men do it too, which traditionally went unpaid, so was barely seen as work at all, and was marginalised, wrongly marginalised, as unproductive. Yet, as feminists have always known, care is actually the cornerstone of everything, of all that enables people to survive and reproduce themselves, hence essential to and embedded within any functioning economy. They're not outside the economy at all. There'd be no markets if we weren't producing more children and caring for workers themselves and ourselves as workers. However, while caring has been gendered today, women and men alike are working those long hours in paid jobs, creating a massive care deficit in richer countries. And this has been met by a whole global care chain of predominantly poor, immigrant and non-white women performing much of our caring work. Thus racism combines with sexism and global inequality to further devalue caring. Moreover, as we've seen, care work is also undervalued, indeed often repudiated, because of that widespread contempt for dependency I've mentioned. Symbolic manhood, as you probably know, has always been presented as the very antithesis of dependency. This disavowal of human fragility and dependency has actually been deepened in our recent neoliberal moment, with all emphasis on the market and productivity. Ideal citizens today, male or female, and of whatever age, are expected to be tough and entrepreneurial, keeping themselves fit and flourishing via the burgeoning self-care industry. And I did have some pictures of the self-care industry, but I left them out. This pathologizing of dependency has also been used to justify the dismantling of welfare and the culling of welfare resources, accompanied by constant media shaming heaped upon those on benefits, at least in the Anglo-American context. Other reasons for marginalising caring work, again illustrated in the collection not being launched here, is that it can be very challenging work. We need to understand, as I think I said before, that care overflows with paradoxes and ambivalence, often generating conflicting emotions towards the person we're caring for, which we usually choose to ignore. For attending fully to the needs of any living thing means encountering vulnerability. However rewarding it may be, and care is very often an interpersonal process, actually, you get something back from the people you care for, which is usually we need. That's something we don't hear much about. So, however rewarding it may be, hands-on caring can also be daunting, confronting us with our own and others' mortal, embodied selves, particularly mortal. This is also why it's been traditionally relegated to women or to servants, people who are deemed inferior precisely because they are doing that visceral, tactile work of maintenance. So avoiding caring can therefore enable others to disavow thoughts of their own inescapable fragility, aging, and mortality. One imagines that Trump doesn't do a lot of hands-on caring. Finally, the challenges of care and worries about doing it adequately easily fuel resentment in caring relationships, especially given its cultural devaluation. It's why feminists have unpacked that mythologized mother-child bond. You know, it's not always as beautiful as our mythologies would like us to believe. And feminists have written about the inevitability of maternal ambivalence. Thus, fully appreciating all these complexities and challenges of care, the mixed emotions easily entwining with our capacities for care, if we have such capacities. We could all have them, but if we are using such capacities, should tell us why we must fight for all the necessary social resources to enable and assist us in the work of care. So rethinking the nature of care also means thinking about time, because care requires time. It means fighting for shorter hours in paid work, fighting for adequate resources, for the rebuilding of our communities, as well as our essential social infrastructures to facilitate mutually fulfilling and imaginative practices of care at any level. For it's only with adequate and secure resources that anyone can develop and maintain their capabilities for caring well and feel they are caring well. Or those being cared for can gain any sense of autonomy and escape from being rendered helpless and passive. And disability activists have written so many interesting things about this and the way they've been excluded from society, but could, of course, be included, all of their needs to be met. All people's advocates, then, along with disability rights activists, have always known this, arguing for a notion of independence and control over our lives, despite and because of the recognition of our own dependence on distinct forms of care. So, the route to reimagining a caring politics begins from accepting both our dependence on others and the ambivalence that this can generate. It means valuing all the skills and resources necessary to promote care in all its manifestations, using creative cultural practices for fostering people's everyday caring capacities. It should be taught in schools, not ignored in schools. Care, for instance, care is crucial at any age because we all need both to give and to receive care. A lot of the loneliness of older people is precisely they have no one to care for, particularly often of older women who spend a lot of time caring in their lives and suddenly find themselves high and dry with no one to care for, particularly if they become more isolated. So it seems to me giving and receiving care is essential to maintain a sense of our common humanity, as well as to help confront our shared fears of human frailty, fears of aging, rather than project those fears onto those we label as dependent, which is, of course, the very seabird of the right, of the rise of the right today. Against the devaluing or even disdain often shown towards caring work, it should be clear from our experiences and giving and receiving care that it can be very enjoyable work, can be enjoyable, whatever its challenges, but only when we have adequate space, resources, and above all, time for doing it well. There's a huge literature on mothering today and how mothers today, find life so difficult. So today, I am getting near the end. Today, it's surely irrefutable how much has gone wrong with a political system that cannot prioritise care for people over markets and profit. Little has changed at government level, but we also need to think more about care for each other and ourselves. In our manifesto, we talk of the need for more promiscuous care. That is a sense of that everyone can help care for others, not just within their families. We're all capable of caring, young and old, and actually there is much intergenerational caring, which is what I'm working on now, going both ways. For caring itself is, as I've suggested, a reciprocal relationship. So we've got to use this moment to think how to do things differently, both for our own sakes and for the sake of the world itself. And this begins with questioning those utterly misleading conceptual ties made between gender and caring. Gender, making it women's work, and gender and fragility, pretending women are the more fragile sex, and gender and ageing, so it's mainly women who grow old. Our attitudes to people of all ages, and indeed to gender itself, begins to shift once caring is understood as something that everyone is capable of doing. Once care is no longer seen as an isolated, private activity, no longer primarily the prerogative of underpaid or unpaid women, but instead seen as a multitude of highly skilled and crucial practices, it has the potential to change all our interactions, beginning with our attitudes to both gender and ageing. Old people like me know that it's crucial to be using our imaginations to think of how best to live in the present and how best to care for each other. Right, I'm almost at the end now. Returning to where I began, the forging of new solidarities, we can see today that celebrating old age is becoming ever more prevalent in women's narratives of ageing. It's evident here in the UK in the refined, often joyful performances of people like Leah Thorne in her, which she wrote a book about called Older Women Rock, which she began doing on reaching 65 a decade ago. Thorne and her companions, I've seen some of their performances, staged theatrical events in which they're sort of mocking those who ridicule old age and all the things we're expected to depend upon to try and pretend to stay young and beautiful. And here too, I've seen the performing group Split Britches with Peggy Shaw and Lois Weaver, who also present thoughtful engagement with queer desire, intimacy and ageing, as they have been doing for over 4 generations. And Lois Weaver performs a piece called Tammy Why Not, enacting and disrupting normative understandings of ageing and desire. She still desires. Or it's there in Wendy Mitchell's book, One Last Thing. And One Last Thing is also written by someone with dementia. She's had dementia for several years, but I think she's written 3 books during that time. So like some of the narratives in your collection, it's telling us that, whatever our condition, in the right situation, we can still interact with others. We can still engage with the world. So that's why it's such a timely moment to be launching this book. Thank you very much.
Lynne, thank you
Oh, I
for
talk for too long.
a wide-ranging talk, which has opened up so many avenues that I think we'll want to follow up on. But what we're going to propose now is that we move sort of seamlessly into the next paper, and then, if that's all right, sir, and then roll the Q&As together, and we can also pick up lots of the questions that will undoubtedly be for Lynne. in the round table.
I'm sorry, I don't know the time.
Oh.
I thought I hadn't.
Okay, I can do it. Thank you. How to follow that? Forgive me putting the glasses on and off. One of the things about aging is my sight is not good when I'm reading, but the distance of the paper, I've not got used to it yet. So thanks to Shelley and Emily for today's event and for inviting me to speak to you today. The title and the image will make sense by the end, I hope. This is a rare opportunity, which is to reflect, I think, on some work I've done. I don't know that we do that enough. I don't know that I do that enough. And Shelley and Emily were very kind and very generous in the flexibility with which they invited Lynne and I to speak about almost whatever we wanted in relation to our work. So I'm going to take you a little bit down the garden path and through some of my work in recent years. As it pertains to ageing and care. I'm going to touch on gender, but it's not quite essential in my paper as Lynne, so I'm hoping they'll complement each other in that way. I'm a literary scholar, or work in the field of literature. And I want to start with a quotation from Sally Chivers, 22 years ago now, and yet still as relevant today, I think, as it was then. And she argued then that humanity's approach to ageing can maintain and consistently maintain the crucial complexity of growing old, because works of art, such as literature, can comfortably encompass contradictions and even gain their strength from doing so. And I love this quotation, and I nearly always quote it when I'm doing anything about literature and age. But I want to ram home the point. So this is a book about women ageing narrative. Stephen Katz argues that narrative is so important. It anchors the inside of ageing, brings together self and society, animates our biographies as we borrow, adapt, interpret, and reinvent the languages, symbols, and meanings around us to customize our personal stories. He does put it well, doesn't he? Kathleen Woodward calls literary texts themselves epistemological tools, and that in reading we can imagine alternative futures for ourselves as we live into lives longer than we had imagined for ourselves. And lastly, then, a more recent quotation from Swinton, Port, and Lipscomb. Fiction offers insights into the meanings of ageing, again, in all their complexities and ambiguities. Living vicariously through characters and the effective responses this involves has the capacity to alter people's views of ageing. Doesn't mean it will, but it has the capacity to do it. And that's my case for why this is important, why this book is important, and why hopefully some of the work we're doing, many of us in this room, is important. And I finished this little support and kind of defence. Shelley and I have had to defend this, as I'm sure some of you have done if you're working in ageing studies and literature, with Shelley and Emily's, I think, a really lovely articulation of a similar idea when they're talking about the volume. So the chapters in this volume share an interest in writing, not as a way of reporting findings, but as a methodology of discovery. And I really love this idea, that writing is fundamentally creative and constitutive of how we see and experience the world. It's not just a mirror. They examine how creative cultural forms, literature, performance, the weaving of a life story, can produce meaning, and how that meaning can reveal otherwise obscured truths, and therefore adds to some of what we know and experience about what it means to grow old and be enmeshed in relationships of care. So that's my starting point, that this book matters and that this work matters. So I hope you're kind of going to follow me on that idea. I think we still need to make that case, though. It's definitely not put to bed, which is why I'm starting with it. There's a lovely article by Achille Swinnen from Maastricht University in 2023, where she talks about this. She calls it, it's called, I can't remember the full title, but Literary Gerontology Revisited. And she talks about why we still need to think about this, why we need to think about this as scholars, as people who read and study literary and other cultural discourses and texts. It's quite an I don't always agree with her, because she kind of slightly turns away from that and says we need more collaborative storied approaches, which I do agree with, but I also think we need this too. But it's well worth reading if you're interested. So moving now on to my own work, which was very solipsistic. I'll just tell you, very self-indulgent. So I hope you will forgive that. I have no picture of my. It's like really weird having your own book on a slide, but never mind. To take you on this journey, I just want to start here. So this is really where I think I started engaging with ideas about care. Not ideas about aging, but ideas about care. I've been thinking and writing about aging for about 20 years, and in that time I have aged. I'm well into my middle age now. I was chronologically relatively young when I started, and my perspective has changed, and I think my journey has been interesting. So this was the start, I think, of my real journey into thinking about care. This is a co-authored book, and much of the research that I'm talking about today I did with colleagues, in particular my colleague, Professor Katsura Sako. That seems to me entirely appropriate, that idea of relationality, working with others, working with other women. And I do a lot, and I think that's kind of cool. So I'm not going to apologise for that. A lot of what I'm talking about today is shared work. So Katsura and I developed this study back in 2019 about contemporary narratives of dementia. We were inspired by the work that had already been done at that point in a similar vein by people like Marlene Goldman, Sally Chivers, Amelia DeFalco, Martina Zimmerman. And our starting point we shared with all of those authors, which was that literary narrative can be a powerful means of the expression of the experience of dementia and contribute to the shaping of the discourse of dementia. And I think where we were coming from there, very much in the vein of what Lynne's saying, was all the negative cultural perceptions about aging and about illness, particularly the experience of living with dementia. So in this book, we looked at lots of genres, including the graphic novel, children's literature, autobiography, and fiction, more broadly. And we thought about how dementia was represented from what we call the inside, the experience of the person living with dementia, and also the experience of persons caring and involved in care relationships. We're thinking more broadly here about how illnesses such as dementia force us to ask ontological questions and interrogate our discourses of agency and subjectivity. It goes right back to what Lynne was saying about interdependence, shared vulnerability. And I think narratives of dementia really get at that and make us think about that. At the same time, and importantly, we were thinking about dementia as a very situated an intersubjective experience that's affected by social and material organisation. And it's very important that we keep that in mind. So we drew on feminist care ethics, we drew on the work of Judith Butler in terms of vulnerability, but we also connected care to reading itself. And this returns us to the importance of narrative, storytelling. We thought about how the texts themselves might promote a caring about. Reading might be a form of care. And we articulated this as a kind of Haraway staying with the trouble. In reading, we're staying with the unsettling, troubling aspects of illness and of care. We also connected this to Derek Attridge's idea of responsible readership. So this work, this book on dementia and narrative, it joined at the time a smallish set of scholarship. But that's now grown in all sorts of interesting ways, and I'm sure some of you in the room have contributed to that. There are now 2 networks devoted to thinking about cultural discourses of dementia. And women's narratives of ageing and care, the book we're here to celebrate, includes a number of chapters in this area of care, ageing, and narrative as it pertains to the experience of dementia. And I think what all of these texts do is insist on the importance of narrative's power to engage us in complex, multifaceted understandings of life and care. More broadly, I think, since this book was published, and certainly since I wrote it, dementia advocacy has continued apace. Cultural narratives of dementia continue to proliferate. I'm not sure we've gotten that far. We have come far from perhaps the situation in 20, 30 years ago, but so much still is there that is troubling and difficult for those living with dementia. If I wasn't here today, I'd be volunteering with a dementia group and working with those living with dementia. And that's made me and that started after I wrote this book, and it's made me so much more aware of the shared vulnerabilities that we experience, but also how they're affected by material and social conditions. So this concern in this book with the relationship between narrative, ageing, and care, Katsura and I didn't want to let that go, and we were so excited about extending it. And we did that in another book, an edited collection this time, called Contemporary Narratives of Ageing, Illness, and Care. And this book shares with the book we're here to celebrate a multi-genre approach. So it addressed photography, film, music, and literature. Shirley's chapter, indeed, on Martine Frank opened this collection and fittingly made an argument about documentary photography, about establishing an ethics of care, and it kind of set the scene for what then the book did. I want to mention another chapter from this book that I think is really powerful and still kind of find myself going back to, and that's my colleague Bridie Moore's chapter. Now, she was looking at Peggy Shaw, indeed, and she looked at drama and theatre and performance and the way that a circuit of care is established between performer and viewer when we experience that. And she called that this circuit of care. Interestingly, though, in that chapter, she extended that beyond the experience of theatre to talk about her own life and her father's Alzheimer's disease and her care for him. And I still find that a very powerful example of inserting ourselves into our work, and that's something I definitely go back to. And that metaphor or articulation of a circuit of care, and of course Bridie's not the only person to have talked about this, to me still helps us to think about what happens when we engage with narrative and other artistic forms. We as readers, as viewers, as listeners, are potentially drawn into a circuit of care. The other chapter that I just briefly want to mention is, sorry, going ahead of my slides here, is a chapter that Katsura and I wrote here for this book. And the reason I want to mention it is that one of the things that we made very clear in this edited collection is that narratives are not always positive. They're not always presenting careful, thoughtful, complex experiences of care. They may be complicit, or they may be questioning, is the way we put it when we were writing about it in the introduction. And as an example of this, Katsura and I, apologies, I thought I had the pictures. Katsura and I looked at some Japanese picture books about care, about grandparental care, actually. So care by grandparents for small children. And what we found in those was that we were getting a very traditional, gendered, familial representation of care, and these were books from sort of the last couple of decades. Now, Japan, obviously, as I'm sure many of you know, has a very low birth rate and long life expectancy, and has been called a super-aged population. And it has had a traditional system of gendered familial care. And this is something that Ueno calls the myth of familial care. And that system's breaking down, though, for lots of reasons, to do with migration from rural to urban environments. There are fewer multi-generational households, more women working. And yet that myth of familial care is still strong. And what we found in these picture books was that very much they supported that myth of familial care, and they didn't really query it. They tended to promote a vision of gendered intergenerational care that's based upon contextually specific notions of duty, responsibility, and reciprocity. That movement then into children's literature and thinking about picture books, it was part of a bigger project, thinking about care as children learn about it. And this is kind of a bit of my work I'd like to talk about just for a little bit now. Katsura and I turned very much to think about children's literature. And children's literature is really important in our thinking about ageing. Age studies, children's literature studies, have a lot in common. Work from children's literature is really useful when we're thinking about ageing, since it's very interested in age stages. It's interested in generational and intergenerational relationships. And it's also, and this is to state the very obvious, interesting because it's intergenerational by its very production and consumption. It tends dominantly, not always, to be written by adults for children, bought by adults, often read by adults to children. So it's got this really interesting intergenerational aspect to it in its very being. So children's literature studies themselves are very concerned with thinking about how we move through the life course and how we discursively construct and imagine that life course. And they're often concerned with care too. And I just put on the slide some ideas that I find quite helpful when thinking thinking from children's literature, which really helps us to think about aging. So Gubar advances a kinship model in her 2013 work, which sort of talks back to the Jacqueline Rose idea of heteronormativity, or the dominance of the adult over the child. And there's lots of work in this vein on the idea that children and adults are akin to one another. They're not others. They are neither exactly the same nor radically dissimilar. So kinship and her application of it indicates relatedness, connection, and similarity without implying homogeneity, uniformity, and equality. For her then, and I love this idea, growth is a messy and unpredictable continuum. And I think that speaks really nicely to what Lynne was saying about the age that we feel we are and the age that we might be, and all those complicated ways in which we understand age. I think we can think about this really usefully if we look to children's lit and children's lit studies. And Vanessa Jewson, a very significant scholar in the relationship between age studies and children's lit studies, talks about the otherness between childhood and adulthood as temporary and then divided into further stages. And she's done a lot of work in thinking about how age studies and children's literature studies can speak to each other and how useful this might be for our thinking. And I think when we're thinking about children's lit and care, there's more to be done here. There's not a lot there yet. There are lots of problems, as Jewson and others recognise, with the uncritical linking of older people and children. Most obviously, the discourse of second childhood, which Jordan Owen McCulloch writes about so perceptively in the book that we're celebrating today. But the need for care is something shared by children and by many older adults. And it's part of the relationship between those groups. When we think about children and their relationships with older adults, which is what we were thinking about in our study of picture books, care doesn't just go one way. We often find in these books it goes both ways. Grandparents are carers for children, and they may in turn be cared for. And so it unsettles and problematizes and interrogates what we mean by care, who gives it, who receives it, I think in really productive ways. So, have I got another 5 minutes? Is that okay? Sorry, I just want to chat. Yes. Is that okay? I don't want to go over too much. So, one of the things, I do have a picture on this one, apologies, I don't know what I've done with the one that had some really nice Japanese pictures, I don't know what I've done with them. In moving the slide to the stick, I've obviously lost them. This is one of the Japanese picture books that we looked at. This isn't actually a woman's narrative, either in authorship or in protagonist. So this is a grandfather and grandson. This is translated as Grandpa's Secret Surprise, I think. Katsura translated it. They aren't translated any of these texts, so the titles don't really work in English, a lot of them. But it's all about a grandfather-grandson caring relationship. But the reason it's on the slide is that what we found in a lot of these books was the prominence of the natural world. Not a surprise, there's a romantic tradition of associating children with the natural world. That natural world is really dominant in children's literature. But it then got us to thinking about, well, what's the relationship, and particularly when we're looking at representation and narrative, between space, and particularly the natural world, and age, and care, and intergenerational relationships. So we started to think about care, intergenerational relationships, as mutually entangled with the spaces in which these things happen, and particularly we were interested in how that's connected to the natural world. And to help us to think this through, we turned to the idea of post-human care. And this is Amelia de Falco's definition of it from her chapter in the Palgrave Handbook to Aging and Literature. I quite like this, nice and clear, I think. So she argues that post-human care describes the incredible range of affects, energies, behaviours, attachments and dependencies that produce and sustain life in modern human worlds. But it describes not only new and emerging human technological entanglements, maybe we'll talk about that later when we have the round table, because it's very important in relation to care, but also a wide range of long-standing more than human relations that create and sustain embodied existence. Relations that are always already happening to, with, and around us, most often in quiet and remarkable ways that are easy to overlook. So I think what we were thinking about was then, what are these long-standing more than human relationships happening around us in these texts? Relationships with the world around us. And also helpful for my thinking here was the work of Bella Caster and her extension of this Toronto idea of care is everything that is done, other than everything that we do, to maintain, continue and repair the world so that all can live in it as well as possible. That world includes all that we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. The web, the network, the enmeshing, these are all kind of, I think, quite interesting metaphors for thinking about care when we move beyond simply the human, without discounting the importance of human care in exactly the way Lynne has just been talking about. So, the other idea, or set of ideas that were really important to my thinking and Katsura's thinking at this point, were Kathleen Woodward's work, prominent age studies scholar, quoted her earlier, but she's been working for a few years now on thinking about climate change and ageing. And that obviously has implications in terms of care. And she advances the idea of generational and human time, and its link to geological time. She's saying that we need other ways of understanding time in order to appreciate what's happening to our world in our anthropocentric age. And she says that generational time, if we yoke it to geological time, is a way in which we can understand climate change. Because she's drawing on the work of scholars who just say climate change is too big. It seems to happen too slowly, although perhaps not now. Geological time seems to move so slowly, it's very hard for us to appreciate it. But if we start to yoke it to generational time, we can understand it better. So I think that way, that was really important, I think, in thinking, right, how do we connect human care, human ageing, human generation to more than human worlds? I did have some pictures, and you those pictures. So we did this first by looking at a couple of picture books, one Japanese and one UK book, that were about, again, intergenerational relationships, grandparent-grandchild relationships. But in both of these books, they're connected to more than human worlds. So in the Japanese book, Jishan, the grandfather and the granddaughter enter a fantastic, surreal, very beautiful, beautifully rendered, more than human world, which is nevertheless connected very much to the natural world. And it's set in Omaha Beach, where it's kind of famous for its turtles in Japan. So it's quite an ecological narrative. But it very much connects human generation, human care, and the experience of human care to the more than human world. And Stardust does this a little bit differently. It's about a grandfather and a granddaughter again. And he tells her the story of the Big Bang. And he takes her to the tops of mountains, and it's beautifully illustrated. And it's, again, a story about connecting generational human time and care to, in this case, cosmic time, and the world on a cosmic scale, and a geological scale. And I think they're really good examples of what Woodward's talking about here. And I'm just going to finish by very briefly gesturing towards some of the work I'm now thinking about. One of the ways in which we're thinking about the natural world and generation and human time and human aging and care, what happened as a result of looking at many, many picture books was that we also noticed that one of the most common ways in which intergenerational relationships are situated within the outside space or the natural world is in the garden. And there's loads of picture books about gardens. Now, gardens are there in children's lit, aren't they? You'll know this. Tom's Midnight Garden, The Secret Garden. Gardens are really dominant when you start to think about it. And I particularly wanted to start thinking about this because the garden's a really interesting space. It's neither entirely wild nor entirely domestic. It's owned and human, and yet it's not quite. It moves on a cycle of seasons that are not human, though they may be affected by human activity, and yet it is about human control, or the urge for human control. So it's a really interesting liminal space, I think, for thinking about human life and human life courses. So, although it does not seem the most obvious thing to look at, and I didn't know this, in relation to aging and care, I think gardens are important. So do other people. And I like to quote them, just, stop just me. So Seguano, in her literary study of gardens, says the gardens matter, and any immutable is long established. But I particularly like this Pottinger quotation. She's a cultural geographer, and she studies gardeners' practices. And she talks about gardeners' practices of care, cultivation, encouragement, and generosity as a purposeful rather than passive expression of quietness, and that they deserve careful, considered attention. This language really echoes, for me, the language of care. Thinking about time, thinking about patience, thinking about relationality. And we can very much connect that to indigenous scholarship on the relationship between humans, human generations, and the earth. And this is Robin Wall Kimmerer from Braided Sweetgrass. Now, we have braiding sweetgrass, and obviously we have to be really careful that when appropriating or cherry picking this very specific scholarship. This is a very well-known book that talks about gardening and the relationship with the natural world and how that connects to human aging and human generations, effectively. And she argues that a garden is a nursery for nurturing connection, a soil for cultivation of practical reverence, and its power goes beyond the garden gate. Once you develop a relationship with a little patch of earth, it becomes a seed in itself. So these are the sorts of ideas that were kind of fueling my thought that actually gardens are important. They're important to thinking about humans, they're important to thinking about aging, they're important to thinking about care. They are a form of care. Gardening is a practice of care. So post-human care theory then helps us to think about this and articulate that. Care for the earth is based upon a kind of reciprocal obligation, but it's also part of a wider web of care that involves human others too. We don't garden in isolation. So in this final garden project, like the final example I'm going to give today, I'm following the idea that in narratives of gardens and gardening, narratives like these memoirs, we are offered a form of generational imaginary that challenges us to recognise the entangled nature of human and botanical stories and times, of what we could call ageing across species. This is an imaginary grounded in the everyday, in the earth, in the dirt, in the frustrations of the everyday work with a garden. And it's also founded in prosaic actions and labour of care and caring for both human and other than human or more than human entities. One that contributes, certainly for me, to our thinking about how we age alongside and with each other. Okay, I'm not going to give you an example. I'm just going to move to close if that's okay, because I'm aware of time. Catch up. So I don't go too far. I was trying to sum this up at the end and think, right, what are the kind of golden threads? What are the key ideas that I've kind of twisted and turned my way through on this very circuitous garden path? I think I want to go back to the idea of the importance of narratives of illness, ageing, and care, situated, materially engaged, complex, ambiguous and ambivalent narratives that give voice to the experience of care. Started from there, the book that we're celebrating absolutely offers us that. But I also want to argue that we can, as I think Lynne gestured at very much, extend our idea of what care might mean and where our responsibilities for care, where our reciprocity in care, where our mutual entanglements might go. And the other thing that I think, and I only recognise this in retrospect, is important, is that life course approach. It is absolutely crucial that we think about older age, but that we also think about older age as part of a story of a life, and as working in an entangled way with other generations of the life course. And I'm going to finish there, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you for, and also thank you for your patience, because I realised that in my hurry to get you talking, I didn't introduce you at all. But
Oh, that's okay. My name's on the slide.
It's at the bottom of the sheet. We've got about 10 minutes for just a couple of questions before we have a break, and then come back with, yes, for both of you, please, yeah. Then we'll come back to the round table with, we have 5 colleagues with us of different areas, who are all going to talk from their diverse points of view about their own work on ageing, care and women. But can I just hold it, open it to the floor now and ask for any questions, please? or maybe I could take chair's privilege, since I don't see hands, and just ask the first question myself, which is to both of you really. And as academics nowadays, we are exercised a lot by reaching out beyond academia and ensuring that there are these powerful circuits between what we write, what we think, and as much as possible, the life and world beyond academia. And it's just a question really about how that circuit works for you, dipping in and out of what are often feel like quite intellectual, concentrated, impactful ways of writing that aren't necessarily going to get out there to everyone beyond our walls. How does that work for you, the circuit between
I think Lynne should answer this one, because she's so much better at it.
I don't know about that. But I've always written politically, I suppose. So I've always written to a broader audience. Because I was in a psychology department, and I don't know if any of you have read psychology books, but they're not much fun. And I was always this total outsider, marginalised within psychology, but publishing because I was a feminist. So, we had newspapers, we had journals. That's where I published. And then suddenly, the ground's always moving in academia, and all that mattered was that you published. And I'm a lecturer at Enfield, and suddenly those who have published become professors. I said, why aren't I a professor? Oh, well, you should apply. So I went the other way around. I was writing politically, basically, and so it's harder to get published nowadays. I mean, particularly if you're going to publish some, you know, a lot of the academic publishers just don't try and distribute, do they? It's incredibly difficult. And then you just have to use your networks. I mean, networks are crucial, it seems to me, whether you're involved in movement politics or whatever politics you're involved in, give talks. You know, it's easy to. It's not so hard to give talks, particularly with PowerPoint and pictures. So yeah, it hasn't been a problem for me because that was where I began politically. But I think it's much harder for people today. Also, the pressure to write and the pressure to write for these dreadful journals, you know, that are in a hierarchical order and nobody reads. Only 6 people read, and there's pressure to do things that are counterproductive actually to getting outside the academy, aren't they? So I guess one has to try and do that a little bit, but it's crucial to get outside the academy. It's sort of a dead place, it seems to me, if you don't try and do that.
Yeah, I think I came the other way. So I think it's hard to get out. It's hard to have impact. To use that awful word that we don't.
And impact for them doesn't mean what impact
means. Exactly. A contested term, isn't it? But yeah, I think it is challenging. I think with ageing studies, with thinking about ageing, with thinking about gender, I think it is politically engaged by its nature. So I think in a sense we've got that advantage. People are interested, people are willing to be engaged and challenged, I think. But finding the fora for that is not always easy.
I mean, the people I was quoting, Joan Nessel and Ursula Le Guin, they're not academics, are they?
No.
But they've got a lot to say about aging.
Yeah.
So jumping the wall of academia.
Do you have another question or comment?
Yeah. Thank you. I loved your presentations, both of them. I was just wondering, following on from that, who are we doing it for? And now, you did mention problems on physically disabled, so I hear you when you say PIP and the sort of balance sheet approach you're making, social care policy, and other international disputes. But who are we doing it for? Who are we changing the dial for? So there have been feminists written about personal self-care, the political economy, and they've read widely. Are you hoping West Streeting will read the book? Or are you, how do we move forward with this? My ideal outcome, by the way, is to give unpaid carers a universal wage. That would be one outcome for me. Well, who are we doing this for? And how do we do it? How do we do it?
I mean, I think from my perspective, and I think Lynne's broader and more political, so she probably would answer this better. But I think these, who are we doing it for? We're doing it for hopefully us all, because we may all need care. We may already need care. If we don't really need care in the future, we may be carers. We may be in relationships of care in various ways. So I think all of us would be my view, that we're doing it for all of us. I think implicit in what you're saying might be the question of whether it makes a difference. Can it do what we'd all love it to do? I think the jury's still out. I think it does. For example, as a really specific example, there was this amazing Japanese book called Twilight Years in 1972. I don't know if you've read it. It's an account of dementia, life with dementia. It's pretty brutal. It's a pretty brutal book. But it had a recognised social and political impact. It really moved the dial in Japan in relation to the way dementia was then talked about. It was very widely sold, and I think Wendy Mitchell has had that kind of impact here in the UK, and that the deep movement, the dementia advocacy groups, and they're all using these stories, aren't they? These narratives as powerful means of I hate that, I've just used the cliche, but I'm going to use it again, of moving the dial, of making us rethink, of potentially having real world impact and changing people's lives and people's experiences. Pass to Lynne.
No, I mean, we're always wanting to cross as many barriers as we can cross, not just intergenerational, but into the workplace or into Parliament. But, you know, not everyone's going to be reading. There's one thing I wanted to say about reading is acts of care, and some reading is, particularly reading our books, of course, but not everyone has got out the time to read our books. But I do think there's a sort of boys' literature that isn't about care, surely. You know, Mission Impossible and top, you know, there must be a whole lot of things that are just about heroes and teaching boys telling boys they ought to be heroes and making them feel failures if they're not heroes. There is that literature too, isn't there? Yeah. So crossing barriers, we'll be talking about that literature as well as other literature. A lot of children's literature, as you say, is about care. One thing, because I'm thinking about intergenerational friendship now, and thinking about it politically, that, you know, ideas are not simply spread because they're so good. They're spread through friendships and through networks. And so, you know, what we have to be doing is, unfortunately, saying yes to everything we're asked to do, which will be quite a lot, but definitely talking to your local political groups, or if you're in a church or local church or wherever, just to get across those barriers. And if you think about how attitudes to the disabled, not just the elderly, but the disabled, they used to be put in care homes, or the bed, not uncaring homes, they used to be just pushed aside until, you know, you got the disability movement starting in the 60s and 70s. You know, that's alongside the growth of the left, where, you know, attitudes could begin totally to change. And now there's a big exhibition opening at the V&A, isn't there, on disability and joyfulness. I mean, that would seem almost inconceivable in my parents' generation, who are your great-grandparents, some of you. So, you know, so we put out these ideas to jump over barriers, it seems to me, and to bring more people in whatever way we can. You know, not everyone is particularly going to be reading academic books, but you have to try and then use our ideas in as many sites as possible, I would say. Hard work sometimes.
That's a wonderful answer. We're going to take a... Sorry, Julia.
That's okay.
Just can it wait for the round table? We start the round table with it. How about that? Your first question. We've got about 10 minutes just for a comfort break while we set up the seating for the round table.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, welcome back and welcome to the next part of our symposium, which is a roundtable discussion featuring a distinguished panel of experts. I'm Emily Jeremiah, Professor at Royal Holloway, University of London, and co-editor with Shirley of Women's Narratives of Ageing and Care. I'm going to start by introducing our panellists, apart from Sarah and Lynne, who've already spoken, and then I'll ask each of them to talk for a few minutes about their own research around ageing and/or care. And then we'll engage in a discussion as a panel, and there will, I hope, be a chance to take questions from the floor. So to begin with the introductions, Karen Glazer is Professor of Gerontology She's been at King's College London for over 30 years. Her research focuses on grandparental care, working beyond state pension age and long-term care. She currently leads the Work and Welfare Programme at the ESRC Centre for Society and Mental Health, investigating the links between mental distress and health-related inactivity, and exploring how individuals experiencing mental distress, as well as their carers, can be supported to remain in work. She also led a UK ESRC-funded project on long-term care and inequalities in later life, part of an international initiative. Karen was the principal investigator of a UK Research Council Lifelong Health and Wellbeing Collaborative Grant, leading an interdisciplinary consortium to examine the impact of extending paid work in later life on health and wellbeing in the UK. This research examined how inequalities across the life course relate to paid work in later life in the UK. She's also led projects on grandparenting in Europe, supported by the Economic and Social Research Council and the Calouste-Gulbenkian Foundation, exploring variations in grandparental childcare and its impact on grandparent health and well-being. Next we have Nuala O'Sullivan. She is the founder of the Women Over 50 Film Festival, a celebration of older women in front of and behind the camera. At the BBC World Service, she created, wrote and produced the interactive online soap opera, The Flatmates, for English language learners. Nuala is the author of Teaching English in Southeast Asia and English Grammar Workbook for Dummies. She's written plays for theatre and has been a series writer for the BBC Radio 4 drama Brief Lives. She's a contributing editor to Falling Off a Cliff, Women, Ageing and the Screen Industry. It's 2023. In 2014, she wrote and produced a short film, Microscope, and it was her experience of submitting this short film to film festivals and attending festivals that brought home to her how underrepresented older women were on both sides of the camera. She set up the Women Over 50 Film Festival as a positive and practical response to this lack of visibility, so that older women in film would have a platform dedicated to them and their work. And then finally, Susan Pickard is Professor of Sociology at the University of Liverpool and Director of the Centre for Ageing and the Life Course. She's published extensively in the fields of ageing across a number of themes, especially its intersection with health, gender and ethnicity, and employs an interdisciplinary approach that takes in literature, history, philosophy, biology, medicine, as well as sociology. She's been PI on several large grants, including a current ESRC grant on frailty and an MRC grant on menopause. She's currently editing a book on menopause in the Cultures of Ageing and Care series with De Gruyter, and co-editing a book on frailty of the fourth age with Paul Higgs, to be published by University of Liverpool Press, both to appear in 2026. Okay, so if I could now ask our speakers to say a little bit about their work, just for a few minutes, sort of up to about 5 minutes, then this will lead into our discussion. So if we start at the end, Susan, do you mind?
No, not at all. Well, I mean, you've said lots about my work. I think I guess my preoccupation is in, well, I work in an interdisciplinary way, but I always come back to my roots in social sciences, and I think that's really important to me because I'm very interested in collecting primary data, and usually work with teams of people from very different disciplines. So we talk, clinical medicine, biology, and philosophy and the arts, and so on. But I very much see this as it's sort of interactive and iterative with my interest in developing theory. So it's a sort of doubling and looping back. I like to collect data, but I like to work on theory in tandem, really, or in correspondence with each other, and that's been quite a strong thread in my work. That's gender theory through the life course, and so mainly and age theory. So I guess it sort of they both collide in the figure of the older woman that I'm particularly interested in understanding in a cultural way, in a multicultural way, I suppose. And I'm interested in finding the best forms of creative methodology, I suppose, to do that. So at the moment, working very multimodally, using creative data, body mapping, photography, poems, blogs, podcasts with people, as well as, you know, traditional observation, longitudinal interviews, and indeed collecting quantitative data. So the methodology has to fit the question, and it's always a creative, risky, maybe. It doesn't always work, but that sort of thing excites me quite a lot at the moment. I guess also the last thing I probably should say is that this comes very much from lived experience for me. So I was interested in aging, I think from the age of 4, when I was looked after by my grandmother, and I thought, her life is so much better than my parents. My parents are so unhappy, they're arguing all the time. My mother's really unhappy. My grandmother somehow has found a place where her identity seems to be not this feminine, vulnerable, crying woman, but it's something stronger, and I wanted to understand that from very young, and I also wanted to find a way, magic realism, I suppose, in going from that childhood straight to old age and missing out what came in between. So there's that, but also I've got a lived experience going back to childhood in care and caring, because again, one of the reasons why my parents were so unhappy, my father developed multiple sclerosis when I was a child, very small child, 2 or 3, and my mother ended up being a lifelong carer and was released from caring, she would put it, on her 82nd birthday when my father died. She's 92. The last 10 years have been the best 10 years of her life, she tells me. But I've seen the hardships, like many people here, I'm sure, of being in that sort of situation up close, and also experienced what it felt like for her. Although it was very liberating, it was a time when she suddenly didn't exist anymore. Her pitiful carer's allowance ended, and she was left without much income at all, apart from basic state pension, and just the whole injustice of this structure, this invisible structure of society, painfully visible to me, I think propelled me into the field of the sociology of health and illness and old age, inevitably.
Thank you, fascinating. And we'll move on to Karen.
Hi everyone. I'm not in the literary field at all, so I'm quite out of place here. I'm a social scientist by background, and a lot of my work is actually working with secondary data, so large data sets. I think that the many overlapping interests, but hugely interested in family care, particularly inequalities. So not only in terms of gender, but socioeconomic status. So I've been doing a lot of work on that recently. And I can say just a little bit about that in a minute. But the other thing that I was very, very interested in is the whole meaning of care, and how to do care and what that means, and how you can actually capture that in kind of national level surveys, because this is often relies on very simplistic measures. But this is the kind of evidence that policymakers often want to try and make changes. So the first thing, in terms of inequalities of care, we're very interested in how different systems, long-term care systems, can actually, either, are fairer in terms of reducing inequalities, or might actually exacerbate existing inequalities. And what we see that in most places around the world, it's not only is care very gendered, so it's women doing it, and women largely doing it young and midlife, although men also do, particularly at older ages for their spouses. But you do see quite significant inequalities in care. So it's usually people in lower SES groups are more likely to do family care. And with more generous systems, you see that that's less the case. So there's less reliance on families and more sharing of care between families and formal systems. So this is, I know that now, they've mentioned in the book this whole crisis in social care, and the government now, as everyone's probably aware, has a whole commission on adult social care trying to make recommendations. And I don't think they really think about how to make these systems not only sustainable, but sustainable in such a way that they're also fair. And to me, that also means less of reliance on family care, which is predominantly women. So that's one of the key things. And we've done some work more recently looking at the impact of right around 2010, there was a really significant reduction in social care expenditure, about 30%. And looking at that inequalities that created, and what we see that although the poorest of the poor group have been protected because they still receive it, those who are just slightly above, they're still poor, but they're not the bottom, are the ones who are less likely to get formal care. So that does do that. The other thing is the whole meaning of care. So now involved with the English longitudinal study of aging, trying to create a better module on social care, but it still asks people, did you care? And actually listening to the narratives of care and literature, and also much more research needs to be in this area. What does it actually mean when people say that they care? And you can see there's Sean Irwin up at the University of Manchester is already trying to invest. There's huge discrepancies, for example, in couples. If you ask one, do they provide care, and the other, they don't agree. And he's also been looking at time use diaries. We did some of this, and I've also do a lot of work in intergenerational care. I mentioned grandparent care. We have been able to try to get at some of that with questions to grandparents on the English longitudinal study of aging, which is a major national survey. Asking grandparents not just do they look after grandchildren, but what it is that they do with their grandchildren. And there's a huge gender pattern you wouldn't be surprised to find in that, and why they do it. So, thank you.
Right. Well, I guess what I think we have to address all the time is how to get rid of the stigma on old age, or just this word, old. I mean, when Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called Old Age in France, they wouldn't translate it as old age in English. They called it the coming of age, although there is now a new edition that is called old age. But there is such a fear, just even of that word, old. And then why? You know, I do think it is to do with the idea of fragility and dependence, and that's why it also attaches to disabled. It obviously attaches to illness, and in particular cognitive decline. And yet, you know, people, there's so much more around it, like in this book, like elsewhere, but to really turn around people's fears is very, very hard. And you know, we have to just try and pull people up all the time on it and see what can be done. I was contacted by a young American who's made a film called Familiar Touch. Is any of you aware of it? Yeah, well, that's interesting that you're not aware of it, because this film, which she made, won first prize at the Venice Biennale. But she can't get a distributor here at all. What's it about? It's about someone with dementia being put in a care home. And, you know, she'd had experience of that. Like you know, her grandmother got dementia, and, you know, nobody would talk to her or relate to her at all. And then she realized she wanted to do something about that. She decided to make a film about it, and she too got a job in at care homes working with people with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And it's a really good film, but you can't get a distributor here. I mean, it's a nice name too, Familiar Touch. It doesn't even mention old, but because that's what it's about, she can't get a distributor. And it's very good acting, fast-paced, you know. But I think it's been distributed in certain other countries, but not here. So it's so strong, people's fears, isn't it? And all we can do is keep talking about it, and you know, hope that people will read more, particularly I think more novels and so on. They're more likely to read, and you know, and we keep talking about. Don't you realise that you're going to get old? Do you really want to be totally passed over and neglected when you're old? You know, and old people obviously do have something to give to us. I mean, we're the only ones that, you know about certain things, you know. I mean, you know, I lived through the 60s. I can tell you about the 60s. I can tell you about the 70s. You know, even if I were getting dementia, I'd probably still have things to say. I probably am getting dementia, but I could still have things to say. And so that's why, you know, trying to think of ways of overcoming that stigma and building friendships, you know, as I say, you know, not just across generations, but, you know, across other sorts of barriers, seems to me very crucial. So I've talked a lot before, so I won't say any more now.
Thank you, Lynne. Do we want to say?
I won't say very much, because I feel like I've just given you my biography, so I don't really feel it. I think the only thing that I didn't kind of touch on, which I think we've probably implicitly or explicitly touched on in other areas, is thinking about the global circuits of care and migration, and I suppose I've been thinking a lot about that in relation to Trump. And you just want to shiver every time you mention his name, don't you? So in relation to Trump, in relation to policy in the UK and how that's changing, and visa regulations, and I suppose just kind of put that out there, that I think we do need to think about that, and how that all of that is gendered too. And then people who come, say, to the global north and care, then what happens to their caring relationships, perhaps elsewhere in other parts of the world. So it strikes me that the idea of networks of care is also global and under real pressure right now.
Okay, thank you, Noala.
Hello, I'm Nuala and I'm 63 years old. Just want to let everyone know what's going on there. I'd like to start to say a little bit about me personally, and then kind of work outwards about what I'm interested in and what we do at the festival. It might be obvious to some and not to others, but this short hair is an indicator that I'm just finished cancer treatment for the second time in my life. And now at 63, I'm an older woman, and I was cared very gently and beautifully by my partner Natalie in both of these occasions, 15 years apart. So I feel, and I also am a person who likes to tell stories. So I feel older women and caring in narratives just hits me personally right on the head in a way that I maybe wasn't so familiar with when I was a bit younger. In the introduction, it also mentioned that there was a short film that I was involved in writing and producing that kind of was the catalyst for the Women Over 50 Film Festival. It was a film called Microscope, and it told the story of an older woman who was caring for her husband who was living with dementia, and she was caring for him but maybe hating him. So it wasn't terribly good, it wasn't a typical, I think, story. And it was just a short, 8-minute short film, but again it really kind of brings all the themes that we're talking about today home for me. And as we said in the introduction, it was going to short film festivals because as a producer, my job was to try and get the film into short film festivals. And I went to film festivals. I was in my early 50s then. The story was about a woman in her 50s. And I noticed when I was watching the shorts on the screen, like a whole day of shorts, I wasn't seeing any older women on the screen. And crucially for me, afterwards, when we were having a drink in the bar afterwards, I was the only older woman. There were sometimes some older men, but I was the only older woman. And it was the first time in my life that I really experienced this invisibility of the middle-aged woman, because I could stand there with my drink, and you can tell already I'm not backwards about coming forwards. I will talk to anybody about anything, particularly art. I've got an opinion. But I saw people looking around the room, and I watched them as their eyes came around to me. They went up and over and round, and I thought, I genuinely didn't know what it was, and then went through all the, is it me? Is it because this is my first film and I don't know the language and I don't know the jargon? And, and it took a wee while for it all to kind of, clarify through conversations with friends and my partner and other people, and realised, oh no, it's because you're an older woman. This is what it is. This is what this invisibility actually feels like. And then it was, again, a good number of conversations and time later that maybe we thought, well, actually, why don't we make a festival where old people are welcome, where older women are the centre of attention, and where someone like me would feel welcome. But crucially for us, we didn't want to make this separate space, because although I think it's great when older women get together and we can have, we've got shorthand conversations that we can quickly jump to about menopause and caring and fear of death and all those things, I didn't think, or those of us that set the festival up, didn't think that change would necessarily happen if older women were only talking to each other. And we thought it was really important to involve men and non-binary people and younger people. And so we came up with this simple rule 11 years ago when we had our first festival, when it was then called the Short Hot Flash Film Festival. And the rule was every short that we showed must have an older woman as the key protagonist on screen. And it could be in a drama, a documentary, animation, or experimental film. Or there has to be an older woman over 50 in one of the core creative roles, the writer, the producer, or the director. So what that means is a 14-year-old boy could make a documentary about his 62-year-old grandma, and the teenager and the documentary and the grandma are all welcome at WAF. So older women are the focus, but everybody is welcome was a really important part of how WAF was set up and what it still stands for. A thing that I think might be of interest today to talk about a little bit is work that WAF is doing in partnership with Virgin Atlantic Airways. And we have, we've been in partnership with them now for over a year, and we're coming into the second program. The first program that we launched was last summer, and we offered Virgin 8 short films that they could put on their in-flight entertainment. And we specifically chose, I specifically curated 8 of our short films that were dementia friendly. So these were films that were super short, very calming, nothing violent or sudden, maybe some very gentle music, and quite simple, though not childish, storylines, not terribly complex dramas. And initially Virgin thought we might get about 200 views a month on these films, and they were designed for people living with dementia and their carers who were flying. So we thought 200 sounded like a pretty good number. The first month it was more than 6,000 views, and over a period of 9 months it was over 61,000 views. And have thoughts about that if anybody wants to bring that up later. And then the other thing that, particularly looking at the book and talking about the ethics in the mystery genre in care homes, it made me think about something that we talk about a lot at WAF, which is the ethics of documentary making. And I think, and filmmaking in general, and specifically what I'm interested in is the ethics of documentary making around people living with dementia, and what does consent mean. And I'd be very happy to talk about some films that we've received, and some films we have not chosen to screen, and some films we have chosen to screen, and what that discussion entails, because I think that's a really interesting, knotty problem. And yes, and anything else about older women in film. And the academics we work with, we've worked with Susan before, we worked with Dr. Deborah German at the University of Roehampton, we worked with Martina Zimmerman, who was mentioned today, and just a hat tip to Lynne, who mentioned the work of Leah Thorne. We've shown a number of her films over the years at the festival, including Older Women Rock. So yeah, that's what I'm about.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Really rich array of sort of perspectives there. I don't know if any of you want to pick up on what any of the other of you has said. Was there anything that struck the panel as particularly resonant, relevant to them?
So, reading the book and reflecting on it and listening to Lynne's and Sarah's wonderful presentations, it just struck me, I mean, and also you just mentioned Simone de Beauvoir, so I have to mention her because she's one of my great interests too. She spent about 300 pages, or perhaps more, of old age, talking about the role of myth in basically shaping and creating ageism. And for myth, we could say stories and representations. So it just struck me as so important. You know, I think you mentioned in your introduction so, you know, precisely and pithily, Shirley, that it's finding a language to speak about things that without, you know, you don't want to fall into the trap of making things ridiculously twee and overly positive, but you want to include the difficult aspects, but you somehow don't want to be feeding into that awful fourth age, social imaginary of the fourth age, doom and gloom and misery. So, you know, there were lots of chapters in the book that did this really well, and you know, like the graphic stuff, which basically left things hanging without resolving them. And you mentioned this earlier, quoting Haraway about just being with difficult things, and so I thought that really the importance of somehow being able to write about difficult things, and about being able to write about care and the difficulties of care as well as the pleasures of care that really struck me. And I guess one other thing particularly that struck me was, again, my interest in theory. You know, there was just some amazing sort of textual exploration of things in terms of, so my question after reading it was, you know, one chapter, I think, was it Avril Tynan that said, she talked a lot about gender theory and said, oh, it's outdated now, the stuff that we draw on, the Chodorow and the Gilligan and things like that, but it struck me that it isn't outdated simply because things haven't changed. And I just wonder, you know, again, we have to reflect the fact that it's mainly women that are carers. Of course, it's not entirely women. And you, again, I think it was either you, Shirley, or Siobhan that mentions wonderful books like Philip Roth's Patrimony, which is incredible. Also, Bettyville. I don't know whether anybody's read that. By, I forget his name, George someone or other. But anyway, Bettyville is about looking after his mother, somebody that used to work as a journalist for Harper's and then went back to small town Ohio or something and looked after his mother. So, you know, there are these narratives of male carers, and there are male carers around, but somehow we have to reflect women's experience, but not play into the idea that it's naturally women that should care. Like, it's just really struck. Why are we still in this position? You know, in 2025, whatever it is, where women are the ones caring. And I learnt a lot from Martina Palla about this wonderful idea of disamore, which, you know, I have a Spanish mother. I don't know whether it's a continental thing. I don't think it is. Very cool when she needed to be. This is the disamore. So I thought, you know, these stories generate amazing concepts which can then be used to, you know, understand the world better, but to intervene in the way things are and to give people tools to, you know, why is this and what can we do about it? So there was an awful lot. I could pick up on the global circuits of care, but perhaps we'll come back to that.
Would anyone like to respond to what's
I just want to say something about gender and caring, because we know that in their younger life and middle age, women will be doing more of the caring and taking time off work and so on to do it. But interestingly, in old age, and particularly regarding people with dementia, I have read that there's more men than women caring, and that's because women, sad to say, are slightly more likely to get it. And also, another thing, someone from the States was giving a talk somewhere, I'll try and remember later her name, and she said that whereas women caring for partners with dementia who could be violent would put them in care homes sooner because they just couldn't manage them, the men were able to cope better with caring for them. Like if they were mowing the lawn, they'd lock them in the car or something like that, and but they'd keep on caring for them for longer. And I found that just interesting, because we do automatically assume that women are overwhelmingly doing the caring, but it's very interesting to think about men who are carers, and you know, that's not what they've been trained to do. I remember Angela Carter writing about her father caring for her mother in her old age and saying, you know, suddenly he was able to do it. You know, they've never cared before very much for their children, but suddenly they are doing it. And of course, they're given great you know, everyone thinks they're wonderful for doing it and so on. But nevertheless, it certainly shows us that anyone can do caring, and particularly if they have the support to be able to do it. So older women looking after their husbands with dementia don't have enough support to do it, and enough respite caring are sometimes simply not strong enough, unlike those men who are doing it. So these are just all stories it's good to know about and think about, isn't it?
Anyone want to pick up on that or develop anything that's been said? I liked what you said, Karen, about the meaning of care, you know, and that's really a crucial matter for now and the future. This has to be investigated and dealt with. How's your work contributing to that project? Would you say a bit more about?
Well, this actually, you know, the work that I do is based on secondary data, so we rely on measures that are already there. But in doing this kind of work, you actually see that when you look at the questions, they just ask, do you provide care?
Yeah.
You know, and then reading the book and then hearing the discussion today, I think, Shirley, you mentioned in the introduction, you know, how do you do care? What is care? And also the very gendered meanings, right? Because if you have couples and, you know, the woman says she's providing care, the man says she's not. So there must be different meanings about what care is within a marital relationship, between a parent or child relationship, parent younger. So all of that, trying to explore what it is that people actually mean by that, what they do. I think, you know, and how do you actually capture that and measure that in some way? I mean, because we need to measure it, you know, to actually, you know, build an evidence base. But also it relates to, you know, if you're trying to look at the different impacts of systems, the whole question of, most of the evidence seems to suggest that families want to be involved and continue doing it. But, you know, how much should families be involved? I mean, there's implicit reliance in the UK system and many other systems that families will just do it. And that's what governments are relying on. But is that really fair? And especially now, because I also mentioned, we're working on the project on, you know, this whole drive to extend working lives, and women, we used to be able to retire at 60, and now we'll be 65, 67 now. And we've, you know, colleagues of mine at King's have actually shown that, you know, if you've got women working longer and later, they're less likely to do care. So then you actually see, and it doesn't get picked up by other family members either, so it drops. So then you need a system that's going to be able to help to give the resources that you need, you know, in some ways to support people. Not completely substitute it, because that's, I don't think, you know, that's on the agenda, but to help in some way. But there is a question of how much should it continue like that? And how do you change, just like with parental care, how do you make it so that men do that as well, in terms of, for example, policies around care?
That's why, as I said, we talked about promiscuous care in the manifesto, and when was first suggested by one of our gay members, promiscuous care, well, that just must mean not really doing caring for long, but no, it means, you know, caring for our neighbours, caring, you know, caring in other ways, you know, like just being involved in caring with and caring about. I mean, the fact that we have allowing things to go on in the world at large that are so horrific, like starving children to death. Why is everyone not caring about that? Particularly our government. You know, we do, once you expand it, then it's never just, it should never be just family care. And family care can be terrible. I mean, you know, we read things all the time about terrible things happening. They're rare, but terrible things can happen in the home. You know, people could think they're doing good when they're not doing good, and certainly not be allowing people in, you know, suspicious of social workers, suspicious of the neighbours, just opening up. You know, we should all be concerned about how people around us are living, but then further and further afield. For me, that's what thinking about care really can promote in terms of expanding our imaginations. But what would a caring home, a caring community, a caring world look like? And that you can't really have proper care without seeing that they do connect. They really do connect.
That reminds me, Lynn, of, I'm sure I read this in one of your autobiographical books. Weren't you, I apologise if I'm wrong, but weren't you at one point living sort of communally?
I still do.
You still do. So picking up on that, one of the things I want to say as somebody that kind of thought it would be a great idea to bring children up in that environment, and it doesn't, it's completely gone out of fashion. This whole idea of the nuclear family, we really have, you know, that the burgeoning of all these great sort of social radical ideas in the 60s and 70s seem to have completely frittered away, and we've become so conservative. And yet again, we see the absolute prominence of the nuclear family, which, of course, again, as a psychologist, you will know, that's the locus. The family is the locus of many good things, but it's also the locus of a lot of harm. You know, I mean, I believe Freud very much made that point convincingly, and I think many of our own experiences would corroborate that. But so this very proprietary idea of who you care for, you know, it's got to be my relative or my family, I find awful and really, just really sad. And the promise of so much of these radical experiments and, you know, living differently, I wonder, you know, we need to probably resurrect some of that as a basis for the care that you're talking about, perhaps. We can't just magic it up otherwise.
Let me just say briefly, there is one group of people who are thinking about living together or trying to find little communities of related, connected housing, and that is older women. But of course, because of property and the price of property, it's so difficult to do. So I know many people who wanted to be involved in that, but everybody has to have a lot of money to try and set it up. I've read about it in the States too, people wanting to get involved in like adjacent households or just houses that connect with each other, and you could have a carer living there, or carers living there as well, getting housing. You know, there's so many, you can use your imagination, there's so many things you could do. But then there's also, living in the sort of capitalist world we live in, is so hard, you know, it's so hard even to get a big house, isn't it? That you have to go in. You know, I bought my house 54 years ago, so I could buy a big house then in central London. You couldn't get anywhere near it today, a house that size. We have these ideas, but so much alongside it has to also shift. Actually, I've been sent a book to by Manchester University Press, and then which I called Aging Radically, it's called. So it's trying to talk about all these ideas. But I'll tell them to publish it anyway, and then you'll all be able to read it. And it very much relates problems of aging to the world we're living in, and how difficult it is to age radically, because you will always come up against these obstacles. Anyway.
One thing I'd like to say here about the kind of the fear of getting old and the fear of women as witches and all these other things that has been mentioned. I think a part of that is fear of death. That as we get older, we're getting closer to death, and that's it's all kind of tied in with all these stories. And an interesting film that we had at WAF a couple of years ago was Live Till I Die, and it was by a group of about 5 Swedish filmmakers, and it was set in a Swedish care home, and it was a documentary. You know, it's kind of day in the life. Sounds a bit like the film you're talking about, Lynn, Familiar Touch, was it?
Yes.
You know, so it was what goes on in a care home, but it was the closest to death that I've seen in a short film, in a festival film representation. And it was so moving and gorgeous, and you had followed this woman and you loved her so much. And she came back afterwards, but I was almost certain that she had died on screen. And that would be quite an interesting conversation for us to have as a film festival, if we were going to show this or not. And actually she rallied. But it was such a beautiful depiction of somebody coming. I mean, her life ended fairly soon after that. We just didn't see it on camera. But it was such a beautiful thing to see. And I think that's one of the things that's come through today, that how much care is this two-way thing. It's not this huge burden that we're always being told it is, and death is not something to be frightened of. And the more that we can see representations of it on the screen or in books, I think is one of the things of storytelling that we can help dispel some of those myths.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to open up the floor to questions because we've only got a quarter of an hour, so it'd be lovely to hear from the audience with questions for our panellists. We had one question, didn't we, at the end? Did you want to ask your question?
Yes, it's a little bit specific, but
Right.
thank you. As we've mentioned, or many of the presentation had mentioned thinking about the kind of life course and ageing across the life course and bringing together ideas from children's studies and ageing studies. And it really struck me, having worked a little bit on film and adolescence and, you know, witnessing adolescents nowadays pretty closely, all of the focus now on what Lynne mentioned, you know, self-care and being resilient and being entrepreneurial and aspirational and self-sufficient and, you know, perfect in every possible way. That sits between reading about caring in children's literature and, you know, it just struck me that that runs through education, socialisation, you know, cultural representation of coming of age as adolescents. And so it seemed that's a real locus of a sort of almost loss of care, loss of sight of care, both for those adolescents and for others.
I don't know if Sam would like to respond to that. That's actually
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. There's a whole, this isn't really answering a question particularly, but there's a whole little subset of young adult fiction that's about, we've always got the missing middle in a lot of this fiction, so it's about grandchildren, or they don't have to actually be grandchildren, they're just broadly intergenerational relationships don't actually have to be familial. But there's a whole subset of them. Often the older person is living with dementia, often in an early stage, possibly undiagnosed. And they're really interesting because you can see in them that tension, I think, between the idea of interdependence and care, yet also the drive, because they're young adult novels, to self-sufficiency, to resilience, to end adulthood as independent, which is what you get in a lot of this fiction. It's about teaching you not to be dependent. That's what a lot of this fiction is. Can you tie your shoelaces? But it moves from that to, like, you must become the author of your own life, tell your own story, and sort of, I think, what you're saying. So you get that in, I think young adult fiction particularly does this in really interesting ways. It kind of hoists itself on its own petard. It kind of wants to do something more radical, but I think it struggles a bit because its whole raison d'etre is to say you can be anything you want to be. You can be an adult. You can enter that world and you can change it.
I think there's also a really interesting thing that you mentioned earlier about the kind of slight similarities between young children and people who are aging, older people. But I think there's also an interesting similarity that's coming out socially that we're seeing when we talk about the epidemics of loneliness. And actually adolescents in particular are so lonely, and we often think it's older people who are lonely, and actually there's a real similarity there, which I think is interesting too. Again, not really answering your question.
No, that's a really interesting additional point.
But loneliness is an interesting one as well, because it gets kind of bandied about as a kind of, almost like a stereotype, like if you're an older person, you will be lonely. And then there's all sorts of solutions to that, some of them which are very kind of neoliberal. Like Sally Chivers writes really interestingly about what she calls curated friendships, and they're kind of like, she's writing about Canada, but she writes about these kind of curated friendship schemes, you know, where you can befriend an older person, and she talks about them as kind of displacing care, as kind of, you know, that they're a neoliberal way of dealing with what is it's a bit like the crisis of care. You get an epidemic of loneliness, and it kind of doesn't address that kind of root cause. It doesn't really look at what's really going on. It's just providing a kind of sticking plaster, a kind of easy solution that doesn't cost anything. So I think there's definitely something there.
Okay, yes, we have another question here. Gentleman.
Thank you. As the only man in the room now, I think loneliness is indeed a profoundly existential affair, and I'd rather becomes a tick box exercise. For me, as an unpaid family carer for my late mother with dementia for 6 years, I found my caring experience profoundly lonely because I gave up my paid job. I did my PhD in dementia, and I wrote books on dementia, and in fact I'm a member of the Royal College of Physicians. I agree with virtually everything I've heard this evening and afternoon. Just to make two small points. One, which I saw the word productivity appear on the slide. The other one uses efficiency, and as a fellow Scot, I strongly reject the neoliberal, not all down to neoliberalism, but they reject the framing of care through that route. You can't make a string quartet play faster to be more productive, more efficient. It doesn't work like that. Now, a close friend actually is a chair as well, and is caring for her father with dementia. As it happens, they get on really badly. But in fairness to me, I adored my mum, even when I was scraping things where I had to scrape them. And just to say, I hear what you're saying about spousal family carers, but there are things sons can't do to their own mother who gave birth to them, like changing contrast pads. They can, but it's very difficult. So I lean towards more of the Professor Kathleen Lynch arguments of effective relations, love, solidarity and solidarity. And you can't measure it, nor can you measure being up all night like I was for 3 years and giving up everything. It was one hell of an educational experience for me, more than I ever learned studying dementia, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thank you. Adotisa.
Thank you very much. That was really, dense. A lot of the ideas there, and a lot of stuff that touches, I think, probably all of us personally. Because if we do think about aging and of our lives, there is something in our lives that brings us to, close to that in any stage of our life, as Sarah's talk also indicated. But I would like to say something about, in response to, sorry, I don't remember the name, about the nuclear family versus the extended family. Because I am Italian originally, and my grandfather lived with us, and he became ill, and he was ill for a year, and we're talking about the 60s. We were very little, and my sister was just a year older than me, and probably was 10, was delegated to look after him, because my mother worked, and she worked even 12 hours a day, so she was doing tactile things, as you mentioned, cleaning him, things that a child would never be trained of having to do nowadays, but it was considered normal, and she was a girl. Now, my grandfather had 2 sons who lived in the same town, but they were not, 3 sons in fact, they were not asked to do any of these jobs. And when my mother said, you have to, my daughter goes to school as well, so you have to step up and come along, they thought it was, well, really? Something completely out of the question. But what I was reflecting on as you were talking about the issue of not being fair for the family to have to look after the old people. But I think there is some elements there that say that living in the family is very important when one is in those conditions, also with dementia, because you are not going to be isolated in a care home with nobody is actually interested in keeping your memory alive. And I have seen some films where people actually, keep the people with Alzheimer in the family as long as they can, and maybe you can have, people in turns in the family, young people, to take turns and show photographs and keep the memory alive, and they give them some life, even at the end. So I can't imagine how good public care could ever be in these cases. So maybe what Lynne was saying about a combination or a collaboration between families and care, community care and all that is the way ahead. But definitely, I think that family should take responsibility. And I know in Italy it's a completely different setup. Now, it's very unlikely that old people are put in homes still. But you normally have somebody, I'm sorry, it is migrants who come from India, from lots of people who need the money to live in and take care of the people. But they are taken care in the home, either their own home or the home of one of the children. And personally, I think it's a much better solution than putting people in care in the way it is done in this country. So I just wanted to say, as my experience, I could say lots of more things about all other things, as if I understand we have to keep it short.
I'd just like to respond quickly, if I could. I think you're drawing too sharp a binary, because, first of all, some older people are completely neglected or worse in the home.
Yes, I know.
And on the other hand, there's no reason that care homes should be unstimulating or neglectful. There's absolutely no reason at all. A care home, particularly, were it to be owned by the local authority, they could be part of the community. There have been care homes which have been more like that. There used to be a Jewish care home up the road from me that, people could go in and out of it. It doesn't have to be like that at all. So I think it's important to realise that both worlds, the home and a public setting, could be infinitely better if we were to prioritise them and connect them up. Like respite care, you need people to go and live for a while in other places and be looked after well. And they can be, and they could be.
Well, I agree with you. I don't have any children, and I'm starting having fear. Who's going to look after me when I can't understand? And where am I going to end up? So,
can I just add that I agree completely with Lynne, because it depends, but actually most public care now is focused on keeping people at home. So it's not targeted so much to institutions, it's actually people, home carers. But the amount of time you have to be very, very severely disabled with very low means to get any help. So that often means, and I think families do want to do it, but sometimes they just can't do it alone. So just, kind of even, not huge inputs, but some input can actually make the difference between people keeping their jobs, people being involved still in the community. So I think it's about the kind of a balance, not substituting one with another, I don't think. Yeah, but I take the point, yeah.
Right, one last question then.
Okay, it's a fairly obvious point which you must be very familiar with, but one of the fundamental problems, which is both gendered and to do with fear of ageing, is the status of and the pay of the people who are doing the caring, isn't it? Yeah. And whilst I don't know, men running hedge funds gain unspeakable fortunes, people doing this immensely valuable job that requires so much skill are paid absolute peanuts and really not considered like serious workers. But yet they were called key workers. We really, really needed them. who were called key workers, and then where's that gone?
And it's how do we set, you know, yeah, I know it's a huge one. How do we set about doing something about that? It seems, you know, really fundamental part of the whole issue and related to so many other problems.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the government is trying to increase the skill levels, but you know, it's about the value of care, right?
Yes, yes.
You know, how you value that. And then, of course, you mentioned the global care chain, because there used to be a whole visa route because it does rely on immigrant labor, especially in London. Because, I mean, it's very, very different in Scotland and other bits of the UK, but London's heavily reliant on migrant labor. But now they've cut that route, they're cutting that route down. So it's, I think, about changing but then you have to pay people more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they're worth more.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, I think I'll draw things to a close here. Thank you so much to our panelists for a really wide-ranging and compelling set of interventions, and thank you to the audience and for the great questions that we've had. We can carry on the discussion over wine next door. So thank you once again.